And welcome back. We are going to explore a little bit more the different techniques for painting with particle brushes, and in particular the animated side of it, so that we can do some fancy stuff, perhaps something like these beautiful particle animations. And keeping in mind that these are painted, so it's not sort of a preset that's always going to give us the same result. It depends a lot on which way your hand moves, and perhaps how fast you go. There's a lot of parameters that will influence which way these particles go. And so you can see them also perhaps being caught by a force field. They seem to be lining up in a force field. That's one of the features, one of the more advanced features. Here's a way to an example with sort of a bouquet finale type of a firework. Lots of different fireworks going all over. All right, here's another one, really fancy stuff. And hopefully I can give you some tips and ideas on how to go about doing something like that, starting from scratch. Let's get started. So here I am in PD Pro Howler 8.1, and the first thing I'll do is I'll create myself an animation. You might start with something like this. I'll create an image of a reasonable size here. Let's say NTSC 720 by 482. And I'll turn it black, so I'll switch to primary and secondary colors, erase to black, and I'll set my animation. Create an animation of not just 30 frames, that would be over in a second. I want it to last, so I'm going to go about 200. Let's see, 2, 3, 4. That's a quick dab of the keyboard. And I think I can get rid of this animation that's still playing in the background there. Alright, so we got an animation sequence. If I'm drawing, it's drawing just without particles right now, so I'm going to enable the particle brushes. Here they are, enable it, and we got the default settings. So the first thing I'll do is I'll decrease the number of particles to just 1 or 2. So it's a little bit sparser. We may change that later on, but initially that's a good idea. And then we get the better control of, we can see where they're all going. Next parameter is perhaps increasing the maximum number of particles. Let's go to about 1,000. 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. I'm too lazy to move over to the 0 on the keyboard, so 1234 is just fine. And then we'll go to the mass and the gravity. Now, so for the gravity, one thing I'll do is I'll make it much smaller, so that it doesn't seem to be pulling it down so hard. But now it is very short, and that's because it's not being pulled down so fast. So what I'll need to do is increase the lifespan, and I'll put that one to about 1 or 200. Let's say 1, 2, 3, and there you go. So we get a much longer, more like a fireworks type of thing. Perhaps we can also make the gravity even smaller. There's 0, 3, something like that. So 0.03, very little bit of gravity. Now, the colors, we need to invert this. The default gradient goes from black and then turns white towards the end. When you click that, we can easily switch it so that it actually starts bright and then goes dark. So you can see here something like this here. Towards the end, the particles will go dark. Alright, so that's already starting to look pretty good. Let's see what else could we do here. The initial velocity, we could keep it fairly small. At 1 is a good start. The terminal velocity, we can make it also fairly small. We'll experiment with that a little bit later. Let's keep it at 9 so far. And now the drag, there's something really interesting about that. If you keep it at 1, it doesn't seem to do any particles. Now, if you keep it at 2, it starts moving. No, it's not doing that. Hold on, there it is, drag 2. Now it's starting, but it's moving upwards, or rather actually it's moving away from the mouse direction. Sort of a reverse action. And then if you give it a negative value, like 0, -1, -2, and so on, then it's kind of moving with it. So it's attracted by the pointer, so to speak, by the mouse. So if I give it like a -1 or -2, even more so, and it kind of accelerates and speeds ahead. So that sometimes is something that you could use to your advantage if you want to create something like a meteor coming in, and you want to show it having particles fly off and away from the incoming meteor. So that would be something to play with as well. Lifespan we have, and 0 splits, no need for that. And I think we're pretty much ready to start doing a little bit of an animation on that. So one more thing we could do, perhaps we have too much on the lifespan. Let's give it 66 there. Let's try that. All right, so here comes our meteor from the upper left and zooms down like that. Now these are very thin particles, right? And so if we go and erase that and render that now with the stroke player, there it is, then we have our stroke player, and the stroke player goes and plays that. Now by default it plays it into the current frame. That's not what we want, so let's go and undo that, or erase it, and say play it all frames. So now we replay it and we see the particles coming in here. All right, so that's the first step, and we can play that, and perhaps we need to play it back a little bit faster. So let's click on FPS, frames per second. We can even preview it at 60 or even more, just to get a very quick look at that. All right, so then we'll just redo that again, render it again with exactly the same parameters, and it will just increase the density of these particles. Now if you want to actually have bigger particles, instead of lines, that's the default style on the particle settings here. Instead of lines, maybe we'll start with shrinking lines, and we'll make them fairly decent size. Let's say something like this, and try that. So now you see much bigger impact there. These particles are much thicker. Now that's initially so, and then gradually they get thinner, right? They are shrinking lines. So through the animation, you see that where they emanate initially, they're pretty big, and then they get smaller and smaller the more they are distant from the originating point. All right, so that's one thing. Now we also want them to change colors. They're all white right now, turning gray and into black. So we'll definitely need to go into one of these channels, let's say the blue channel for instance, and say initially we don't have much blue, so it's kind of yellowish, and also no green, so it's more of a reddish tint, right? And then maybe the red increases over here and the green increases. I don't know, it's going to change colors one way or another. So let's go and render that. There you go. Now you're starting to get the mix of these. Now so far I haven't erased the animation. I've basically kept accumulating everything here, and at some point it may be a little bit confusing. So one thing you can easily do is you right click, oh, not here, you right click on the X that erases and say clear all frames. All right, and then so that way everything is back to erased. Do a replay, and we got a starting point with our colors again here. All right, let's see what else. Maybe we want to, instead of shrinking lines, we want to add, well, let's make them much bigger. Okay, something like this. And be patient for that. That will take a while to render, but it's a good idea to try that as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with also adding some filter effects every once in a while. You might want to do a blurring, or you might want to do, you know, like a motion blur or something, or a, what could it be, something like a Gaussian blur along the timeline. So go to the timeline and render something like, where's the blur category? Transforms. I must have gone past it. There it is. And do a little bit of a Gaussian blur, not a lot, just a little bit there, and that will allow it to make it more like smoke appearance, right? Smoke trail or blurry appearance there. And then you can always render another crisp set on top of that. All right, so here we go. So far this is what we've got. Now let's say we want the particles not to just emanate and fly away from it, but kind of leave a trail along the path. Now what we can do for that is reduce the initial velocity, right? If we have a high initial velocity, let's say 7, they're going to go away really fast. And you can see that they're now even shooting ahead of the main meteor, right? So they're flying far and fast, right? And if we don't want that, if we want to actually leave a trail that's visible along the entire path, what you want to do is essentially prevent them from flying fast. So you want to set the initial velocity very small. That can be a fraction, 0.1. And then you can set the terminal velocity very small too, like 1. Right? And then perhaps, let's say shrinking lines, let's keep it there and see what that does. Replay that. So now we have some particles. They're still flying a little bit. Maybe one is still too much here, so we'll need to get the terminal velocity at 0.1 as well and see if that's better. Yeah, now we have a little bit of a trail that's visible here. Now we could possibly, okay, let's do an erase again here to see without the disturbing side effects here. Clear all frames and replay that. See, now we see that trail in the back there staying. Now we want them to move a little bit still, so maybe 0.5 for the terminal velocity. Yeah, so they're starting to move a little bit. I think we have some gravity still pulling them down. That's no good. If it's high altitude meteor in the upper atmosphere, we shouldn't see too much gravity distorting that smoke. So let's keep the gravity at 0. What we could do is perhaps have a little bit there on the initial velocity, and then also a little bit more on that. All right, so that's probably going to be just perfect there. Right, now these particles are shrinking lines, and they're getting smaller and smaller over time, and really what we ought to do is have them get bigger, or at least stay at the same size. So one thing I would recommend is we go with the Nova or the brush. Let's try the Nova first. Nova actually is pretty well done for that. So we'll try it first small size. It may take a lot of time to render. So let's go and replay that small size initially. And that tends to be a really good one for smoke trails, and you'll see that here as it's rendering it there. Let's go a little bit bigger perhaps, but before that let's play it or just preview it here. Yeah, that looks like a little bit of a smoke trail. And if you want them to be there longer, simply increase the lifespan there. Let's go now over 100, 123, right, and reduce the terminal velocity a little bit so they stay even closer. There you go. There you go. So now we got a nice little smoke trail that doesn't seem to be going away too fast, too quickly. It looks a bit funky, by the way, when it's rendering. You don't see every part of the rendering there because of the interlaced nature of the video retrace and all that stuff. But once you have it there, you'll see it as you play it. So there's a nice little meteor coming in. Alright, so let's go and erase all that and do a few more things. So we have the Nova that we've tested. Now let's do one more, which is the brush mode, which means we're using the regular brush. So whatever your current brush is, let's say something like the airbrush, maybe a medium or a large airbrush, and you get to choose the size here. You can change the size. That will actually be taken into effect, but still keep it enabled on the particle brush. Okay, so you're forcing the current brush, the airbrush, to go render along the particles. And so that's an interesting way to also keep the size or maybe the opacity under control. You can do all sorts of things with that. You can set the mode to smear and other things. So play with that a little bit. Let's go and render that. And so here is our incoming meteor. And of course, one thing I'd like to do as soon as it's done here, the meteor itself should be pretty bright, so I'm going to need to add something like, there you go. Yeah, that's pretty good. So one more thing I'm going to need to do is wherever that meteor is, I'm going to need a bright spot there. And that's, of course, something like not the gradients, the nova or the lens flares, right? So we actually have that animated, so I'll put that right there in the timeline editor, all the way at the bottom of the filters. We've got the lens flares, and with that we can go, let's choose the flare settings, one of those bright ones like this. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. For a big bright flare or something like this one. We don't want too much disturbance on the lens reflection itself, so yeah, I guess this one here will be fine. Let's do that. And so the trick here now is to actually identify where it is and where it's going to go. All right, so right now up here, this spot where the meteor enters is up here in the upper left. So we'll place it right there and set a keyframe there. And actually what we'll do is we'll make it a little bit less level, like bring it down lower, so that initially it really hasn't touched the upper atmosphere yet and hasn't burned much. But then as we go maybe this far, we need to have it move to this place and start increasing the brightness. right? And then as we go about the same distance this far, we have moved here. And then we bring the brightness up even more. And let's see what else. So we keep going about this far. Now we're over here. Just click there. Doesn't have to be too precise, you know. Let's keyframe that. Let's go down to this one around here, and still getting brighter. And then we go about here. That's reached this position, something like this, and now suddenly it kind of explodes or something, goes really bright. That's going to take more time to render, but it's definitely worth the wait. And then here we go berserk, right? I mean, we are here and we explode. Big bright spot there. Okay, so and then in the end maybe we have exploded and it goes away. Alright, so we have this meteor coming in like that. All we got to do now is render it. If you're not quite sure what you're doing and if it's gonna look the way you want it, make sure you click here to save undos. But if you're confident, or if it doesn't matter and you just like to do this again and again till 3 o'clock in the morning, just click apply, and soon enough you'll see that meteor coming in and leaving a little smoke trail. We can still work on that smoke trail, by the way. I mean, the lens flare is something that we want to do for the bright spot where the meteor is, but then on top of that we also want to perhaps work on the trail itself. So let's see what we've got here. We've got a little bit of an animation there. Yeah. Alright, so we still need to do a little bit more on the smoke. So let's go back to the particle traces. There you go. Particles, and what was it? The nova looked really good. This time we'll give it a little bit more on the size. And let's see, we can get rid of this. And let's go render that one more time with the nova along that. So that gives us a little bit more of a smoke trail in the back there. Well, that might be too much. And of course that's where you say, oh, I wish I had saved it so I can undo that, right? But you know, no harm done. This is just for demonstration. And one thing you'll want to do is save often. You'll always want to save. You know, go to animation here and save, or save AVI. If you want it in uncompressed or rather lossless format, I would recommend the Lagarif codec. It's free, it's awesome, it's fast, and it's lossless. Anyway, so here's an example of an incoming meteor first attempt.